Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to combine two chapters, chapter 15 and chapter 16. So we're going to talk about carboxylic acids, esters, amines, and amides. So in chapter 15, one example of a carboxylic acid here is shown below. In vinegar, the main component is something called acetic acid, and that is a carboxylic acid. So we'll talk about that more later. Additionally, we're going to talk about amines, which are present in, for instance, fish. So that's what gives fish their fishy smell. It's also something that's really important in, for instance, medications. In morphine, for example, we've got this ball and stick model, and nitrogen is shown in blue. But additionally, nitrogen is also really important in the function of our neurons or neurotransmitters, so we'll talk about that later as well. So in this video, we're just going to do a brief overview of these four different types of molecules or functional groups, and then later we'll go into how to name them, their physical properties, and their reactions. So just as a little bit of review, carboxylic acids contain a carbonyl group. So in that sense, they are similar to aldehydes and ketones, but off to the right or the left, depending, they have an alcohol there. So this whole thing is called a carboxyl group. You can abbreviate this as COOH or CO2H, and it's just understood that the carbon is double bonded to one of those oxygens and then singly bonded to the other oxygen. So here are just some examples of different carboxylic acids. Some of them you might have heard of before. So formic acid, for example, is used as a food preservative. It's also what some insects use when they sting you. Acetic acid we already talked about. That's present in vinegar, but it can also be used as a preservative as well. Propionic acid is used as a mold inhibitor. And then butyric acid is that chemical that's responsible for the bad smell that butter gets when it goes bad. So if you've left butter out for too long and it smelled bad, that odor was caused by butyric acid. So we'll talk more about naming later on, but I just wanted to show you some examples. Additionally, carboxylic acids are found in what are called fatty acids. So you might have heard of fatty acids in relation to foods. You know, there's healthy fatty acids, not so healthy fatty acids. It gets very confusing, but basically in these fatty acids, one end has a carboxylic acid group. And because we have two oxygens on that carboxylic acid group, it is a polar group. So it is attracted to water. It's hydrophilic. So that means that this end of the fatty acid is soluble in water. But the other end contains a lot of hydrogens and carbons. So that is our hydrocarbon end of the fatty acid. And remember, carbons and hydrogens are nonpolar when they're bonded together. So this would be the hydrophobic section. And because it's hydrophobic, that means it does not dissolve in water. So it's water insoluble. But we'll look at some more biological examples of these different types of groups later on. The next group we're going to talk about are esters. You can also call these carboxylic esters. And esters look pretty similar to carboxylic acids. We've got this, group here, but then we have this additional carbon group that's bonded to the oxygen. So the bond between the carbonyl carbon and the oxygen is referred to as an ester linkage. So esters are key structural features in fats, oils, and other lipids. Lipids are a type of biological molecule, but we'll talk more about those later on. So esters are also found in fruits and flowers, and they smell really good. Some esters, not all esters. So esters are commonly used as flavoring agents in food, or as scents in things like lotion or perfumes. And there are some esters that smell like apples or pineapples, for instance. Some smell like bananas. So that's why they are used in a lot of different products. The next group we're going to cover is amines. So amines are derived from the molecule ammonia, NH3, where one or more hydrogen atoms have been replaced by an alkyl group, so an R group. So as an example, let's look down below. There are actually three different classes of amines, kind of similar to alcohols. So we have primary amines, secondary amines, and tertiary amines. So you can see that we can also abbreviate primary, secondary, and tertiary using a 1 with a degree symbol, a 2 with a degree symbol, or a 3 with a degree symbol. But the main idea here is that if we replace one of the hydrogens in ammonia with an alkyl group, we end up with a primary amine, and an example is shown on the right. So again, that central nitrogen is bonded to 2 hydrogens and 1 alkyl group. And then secondary amines have a central nitrogen that's bonded to 1 hydrogen and 2 alkyl groups. So you can see an example on the right. And those R groups or alkyl groups don't have to be the same. They could be different. And then a tertiary amine is a central nitrogen that's bonded to 3 alkyl groups. So we've got our final example on the right there. But again, we'll talk more about this later. Now, the last group we're going to talk about in this series of chapters is the amide functional group. So amines can react with molecules called acid chlorides or acid anhydrides to form amides. And we'll talk more about acid chlorides and acid anhydrides a bit later. But amide groups, again, have that carbonyl group in the middle. So carbon double bonded to oxygen. And then we also have a nitrogen group bonded to the carbonyl carbon. So that's what makes up the amide functional group. And these are really important in things like proteins, peptides, etc. But we'll talk more about that when we get more into the biochemistry part of the class. So this bond in the middle here is called an amide linkage, and it's a really strong bond. So it can also be used for protective gear, for instance. Now, to remember the amide functional group, you could think of it as, your amine group on the right, and then the portion here from a carboxylic acid. However, in order to form an amide, you actually would use an amine with that acid chloride or acid anhydride. If you try to react a carboxylic acid with an amine, you just end up with a salt. So we actually don't see an amide form from the reaction of a carboxylic acid and an amine. But this is just one way that you could try to remember what the amide group looks like. So next time we're going to dive into naming, also called nomenclature. So we'll talk about how to name carboxylic acids, and then we'll kind of move on to the other groups after that. We'll also start talking about physical properties of all of these different groups, as well as the reactions that they can perform. So I will see you then.